Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast, the podcast where we sit and sip, talk all things Civil War history, bourbon, and whiskey. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah. Today we are coming to you from the historic Bell House in beautiful downtown Winchester, Virginia. The Bell House is preserved and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, managing entity of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District, and the official sponsor of the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Battlefields Foundation. Every dollar you give to support battlefield preservation in turn helps supports the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast. You can do that by going to shenandoahatwar.org. That's www.shenandoahatwar.org. Click on ways to give and find membership. And membership start as low as $35 and go till you can't give no more. So help us out and help support the Battlefields Foundation by becoming a member today. An exciting episode we have today. Yes, Elijah. We are here, and we've got our great friend Phil Spaugy in the room with us, joining us again for another episode. Say hi, Phil.
Hi, Phil.
Perfect. We've got a really special bourbon brought to us by Phil today, and before we get into the story behind it, Elijah, tell us a little bit about what we're sipping on.
So we are going to be sipping Horse Soldier's Barrel Strength Reserve Bourbon, and this is from Horse Soldiers. They're based out of Bardstown, but it's distilled in Ohio, so I can't exactly tell you who makes this as far as the distillery, because I believe it's sourced. But this one is 70% corn, 20% wheat, and 10% malted barley, which I was unaware this was a wheated bourbon. I was always under the impression that this one was a high rye or something of that nature. But you learn something new every day. And this one, not age stated, so not really sure what it is as far as that goes. Always heard it's 8 years roughly, and then this one is 110 proof. So they vary from batch to batch. It's not like a consistent thing where you'd see something like Wild Turkey Rare Breed that's a barrel proof bourbon at 116.8 every single time. So it does have some variability to it. But you can give it a little nosing, a little tasting, see what we think.
Real sweet off the nose.
Almost get a sugary kind of nose to it, like a rum finish bourbon. But
yeah, sweet off the palate.
I don't get much of that wheat. Sometimes with those wheated bourbons, you get that honey vanilla. But this is almost a little drier than that. It has like a rye spice to it, although it's not in there.
It lingers a little bit.
I like that, though. It's got a nice cinnamon kind of
yeah, it does have like a cinnamon type of taste.
That's interesting. So that's one of their quite a few in their lineup. So we'll have to experiment with some of their other products as well, but I'm a fan of that. I think that's really good. I
was always excited to do this one. I just never know when we would do it. Mm-hmm. Just so happens Phil wanted to bring it on today, which was much appreciated. And I always loved the bottle. And it was like when you think bourbon and you're looking at the shelf, you see Horse Soldier, and if you're a Civil War guy, you're like, well, this was kind of cool. Let's kind of the background of it. I think it was started by veterans.
Yeah, Green Berets.
Yeah, Green.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think it was off of that horse store, the Horse Soldier story in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's what it says on the label.
Okay.
Here.
Huh.
Yeah.
So not Civil War horse soldiers, modern day horse soldiers.
There you go.
But
close enough.
Yeah, there's a movie about them. Yeah. Phil, what's the story behind this special bottle?
That bottle right there was given to me in April on my 70th birthday from Eric Wittenberg, the premier Civil War cavalry historian. I think no one can doubt that. Eric's a friend, and he has, within the last year and a half, has really been undergoing some tremendous health challenges. First cancer, which basically has put him in a wheelchair, followed by about 2 months ago, a devastating stroke. So the fact that he came over to our house to my birthday party, about a 60-mile drive, and gave me a bottle of Horse Soldier was really special. There is a GoFundMe for Eric. You can just search GoFundMe. They do need some financial help. Eric and Susan are great people. He's given a lot to the Civil War community. not only his scholarship, but some of the work he's done legally for Battlefield Trust and a lot of other battlefield preservation entities. So sometimes it's time to give back, and he's got quite the struggle. He's doing better, but he's got a long way to go. So if you're so inclined, look up his GoFundMe and maybe kick him a few bucks.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up and kind of got to shine a light on, not all the bottles we have here have a meaning to them. So sometimes they're just mailed to us or we buy them. So I wanted you to be able to share that.
The other thing is we're sitting right on the battlefield of 3rd Winchester right now, talking about a big cavalry charge, what Jonathan did a couple last Friday, talking about that. So that kind of fits there too. And we're going to talk about George Crook, and he is a horse soldier too. So
exactly. Well, so as we're sipping on Horse Soldier today, we brought Phil back on the podcast. If you didn't check out the episode he did for us in the fall of 2023, we covered the 19th Indiana at Gettysburg, the first day at Gettysburg. And, we followed him through the rest of the days there. And that's an amazing episode. So if you haven't listened to that, check that one out. But today, Phil will be discussing George Crook and his kind of entire story, an often overlooked commander throughout the Civil War, but the ones that, the historians and folks that are into the Civil War that do know him know how important he was to the Civil War itself, and then even pre- and post-war affairs with the military. So, Phil, take it away. Tell us about George Crook.
Why George Crook? I think what we're going to do today is we're just going to talk about kind of discovering George Crook a little bit. For me, why George Crook? Being an Ohio guy, it was always Sherman and Grant, not so much Sheridan, not so much Custer, but Sherman and Grant. And, you knew that Crook played a role in the war, but I don't know. I was probably in my early 20s, and Bob Younger, who had Morningside Bookstore at the time, was a friend, and we were talking. He goes, well, George Crook was born in Wayne Township, which is right, a direct line from my house now is like 6 miles. And I'll show you where the old farmhouse was, and we went out, and it's gone. It's burnt down in the 1950s. And so I never gave him much thought, and in the general histories, he's mentioned, but it kind of always defaults over to the Indian Wars and the Rosebud, and was he at fault there? And we'll get to that. So that kind of got my interest going. As I got older, I started researching the Crook family, and one of the funnier stories is a couple of quick personal stories about the Crooks. Is the first one is my wife Amy and I went to a local car dealership to buy a new car. And the young man came out and he introduced himself, and I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Crook. And George had a lot of siblings, so there's still a lot of Crooks around Montgomery and Miami County, Ohio. So this kid said, "Hey, my last name's Crook," and I'm looking at him and I go, "Do you have maybe an ancestor that was a Civil War general or general?" And he goes, "I hear there's some soldier, some famous guy in our family, but I really don't know." And I looked at him and I go, "Well, you've got the same steel gray blue eyes that General Crook had." And he goes, "Whoa,
yeah,
do I want to sell this guy a car or not?"
Yeah,
I know all
he's
about
looking
you.
at my eyes. So we bought the car.
there you go. You bought a car from a Crook.
Yeah, we bought a guy. It's a car salesman named Crook. That had a history background. Yeah. So we got a big kick out. And then I sent him a bunch of stuff on his family, and he appreciated it. And I've never heard from him again. Yeah. A couple years later, they were doing a Walk of Fame in Dayton, Ohio, at what is now the Wright Dunbar National Park, and getting famous Daytonians, Montgomery Countyans, and George Crook had been nominated. And believe it or not, no one in the Crook family wanted to come and accept his star for his Walk of Fame. So my sister, Kathy, had been involved with the committee, and they were looking for someone, and he said, "Well, my brother, is a Civil War guy, and he can come." And so I got to accept his star for the Walk of Fame in Dayton, and it one of those deals that, okay, I'll do it. And, you got to give a little speech, okay. And then you walk into the room, and it's a big luncheon room with white linens and more silverware we have in our house on the table, and all the mayor and everybody there. So I got through that. So that, all these things all of a sudden fueled my interest in George Crook. And the more I got reading about him, the more I came to understand that there was probably not another soldier in the last half of the 19th century who had more combat experience before, during, and after the Civil War than George Crook. So we'll get into it a little bit. He was born on September 28, 1828, near Dayton, Ohio. Okay. His dad, Thomas Crook, and his mom came from Maryland. He had, believe it or not, he had 9 siblings. Maria, Catherine, Oliver, John, Thomas Jr., and Walter, James, George, and Charles. They were a real distinguished family. 3 of his brothers became doctors. One was a state senator. His sisters both married very well in the community. And that the fact that there's so many of them, it still astonishes me that the family today, it just, you can't find much interest in their family background.
Huh.
So George's father, Thomas, owned a piece of land that was, shortly after he bought it, the Miami and Erie Canal ran right through. So it became very valuable. So it was a pretty well-to-do family. There was a neighbor, and this neighbor was named John Cuppy. And if you've ever done any study on the Revolution on the western frontier, you may have heard of Brady Scouts. And they were an outfit that western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, basically hunter-killer team against Native Americans on the frontier. And Cuppy had been a Brady Scout. And it is said that George Crook, as a young boy, and Cuppy lived to be 100 years old. Wow. He died in 1861. He was born in 1761.
Wow.
So it's said that George Crook spent a lot of time with this John Cuppy and learning the ways of the frontier and such. So it comes time, Congressman Schenck, who would later become a general during the Civil War, probably recognize his name from the Second Battle of Winchester, okay, needed to have a candidate for West Point. Okay, so he remembered that old Squire Crook had a son, a pretty solid son, he said. And the quote is really pretty good, if I get up here.
Pretty solid.
Yeah. And a lot of this is going to be in his own words.
Looking back to that time.
Yeah. You know what happens is when you hit the wrong button.
Now, did any other siblings, male siblings, have any role in the military?
That
or was
is
this just George?
Thank you for teeing that up, young. That's good. You guys are good. Walter, his brother, who we mentioned a little bit ago, was captain of Company F of the 74th Ohio, which was raised in our township. And he's buried about 5 miles from our house. The only battlefield they were on together was Chickamauga. The only time they were, I don't know if they ever saw each other. Walter was a bit older, like 8 years older.
So he was more Western theater?
Yeah.
Okay.
The whole time.
Gotcha.
Of course, George bounced around too. He was Eastern theater, Western theater, Eastern theater. And that's one of the other intriguing things about him is his service during the Civil War. And I'm about ready to find what I need to find.
Phil's locating a quote. For everybody listening,
I could make up a quote, but you wouldn't want that.
No.
So anyhow, Schenck says, Robert Schenck, who is the United States representative, says, I had looked over the district to find a bright lad to nominate to West Point to fill an existing vacancy. I was unsuccessful. I finally remembered that old Squire Crook, a fine old Whig farmer, and a friend of mine had some boys, and I sent word for him to come to town. He came in. I inquired if he had a spare boy he'd like to send off to West Point. After studying a while, he said he didn't know what he had. I suggested he send him in. He did. The boy was exceedingly non-communicative. He hadn't a stupid look, but was quiet to reticence. He didn't seem to have the slightest interest or anxiety about my proposal. I explained to him the requirements and labors of the military school, and finally asked him, "Do you think you can conquer all that?" His single reply was, "I'll try."
And back then, I mean, correct me, West Point was still a big deal.
It is a big deal.
Yeah, and Crook was like, "Oh."
He was.
Yes.
So he says, I'm going to try.
I'll try. Hey, that's all you can do.
He goes to West Point, and the class of 1848, and he ended up so undistinguished at West Point. Not many demerits, not much written about him. Never got a single package from home.
Just got by.
He got by. He got by that he actually graduated 38th out of 43. And to this day, he's the lowest ranking cadet to ever become a major general in the regular Army.
Wow.
He's got that going for him. Okay. So, when he's in West Point, his best friend, his pal, his roommate is little Phil Sheridan. And I know everyone has probably seen the picture of Crook, and then there's little Phil in between them. And then there's a lieutenant by name of Nugent, who would die on duty post before the Civil War. But he and Crook were pretty solid. They're both from Ohio. Both came from pretty much, I wouldn't say Crook was from a hardscrabble family, but, not from a particularly social class family, which means they didn't fit in real well at times. You get a drink. So George gets out. He's assigned to the 4th U.S. Infantry, which, that was Grant's unit. I mean, a lot of famous Civil War generals ended up in the 4th U.S. And he gets assigned to the West Coast, to fight Native Americans, excuse me. So when he gets out there, gets assigned to his first unit, he's a brevet second lieutenant. He goes right to the West Coast pretty much, stops at Fort Columbus in New York for a short tour, and ends up doing a lot of escorting different parties there. He gets involved in the Rogue River expedition and the Pitt River expedition, and he really gets into small unit actions against Native Americans, and this would become his forte.
He gets into it as an interest, or
as an interest,
involved?
And understanding that this was the way to combat Native Americans.
Yeah.
Small unit.
Do you think he learned this from Cuppy?
I think he learned. Yes, you're right. I think a lot of the stories from Cuppy, and
helped develop his interest, and he was a bit of a loner. Yeah.
So he gets this interest and becomes, really, and he participated he was not a guy that led from the rear. So by 1856, he's really in one of his first Indian fights. And in his autobiography, he talks about he calls it his first Indian. And he says, directly I saw some buck tracks. So initially I'm reading this, I said, well, he's deer hunting. Well, he wasn't deer hunting. That's what he called, you read his autobiography, that's what he called male Native Americans, bucks. By this time, I could follow them at a gallop. The chase had now become so exciting that I thought but little of the danger. I saw the Indians running ahead of me. I rode up to a buck, dismounted and wounded him, remounted and killed him with my pistol. That was my first Indian.
Wow. So he took kind of like a sick pleasure in hunting them down.
You just read the words, man.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's insane.
And then as we go through the story, we'll talk a little bit about how his feelings towards the Native Americans would change. So then he talks about another one. He says, when he was wounded, I saw a buck swimming with his bow and arrow and wolf robe held above his head. I aimed at the edge of the water. At the crack of the rifle, he sank, and the robe and weapons floated down the stream.
Wow.
I at once commenced reloading my old muzzle loader when the guide at the top of the bluff said, "Look out for the arrows." I looked up and saw the air apparently full of them. One hit me in the right hip. When I jerked it out, the head remained in my leg where it would remain for the rest of his life.
Oh, my gosh.
Okay. There was a couple of inches of blood on the shaft of the arrow when I pulled it out. And he almost died from that.
Wow.
But there's other stories about his service. This is prior to the Civil War. And like I said, he was out there 7 years, never came home.
So he's just getting into it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, he was. That was his. He was an outdoorsman. He loved to fish. He loved to hunt. He didn't mind being out in all kind of weather by himself at all. There's more stories about himself hunting and being stuck in bad weather and how he got through it.
Now, when you say he's out west coast,
We're Oregon.
Oregon. Okay,
yeah,
I was going to say.
Oregon. Yeah.
I figured that area.
So the Paiutes and when you think about the Indian Wars, what do you think first? Probably Sioux and Sioux, Apache, Cheyenne.
Yeah.
Pretty much, right? I mean, the Western, but the action of the Modocs and the Paiutes up in Oregon, Washington State was pretty brutal too. So, 1861, when war comes, George gets called back east. He gets appointed colonel of the 36th Ohio, September 13th, 1861, and he gets assigned to the regiment that is in West Virginia, or in Virginia, Somerville, Virginia, then West Virginia now. He sets up a regimen for the 36th of reveille and duty call and fatigue and drill. He builds a 700-foot long, they said, building so they can drill inside during the winter. Has them build this thing. So as he's training his regiment, and you guys are well familiar with the small unit actions, the guerrillas and bushwhackers in West Virginia, Virginia, soon to be West Virginia. George has a real problem with the bushwhackers and counterfeiters. So what he did was he applied his Native American tactics to what was happening to the people to West Virginia and to his troops. He said, being fresh from Indian country, where I had more or less experience with that kind of warfare, I set to work organizing for the task. I selected some of the most apt officers and scattered them through the country to learn it, and all the people in it, particularly the bushwhackers, their haunts, etc. And this is one thing that George did throughout his career. He would use Native American scouts, or in this case, civilian scouts, to learn about the enemy and to learn about their whereabouts and the best way to strike them. Particularly the bushwhackers, their haunts, etc. Very soon, they commenced catching them and bringing them in as prisoners. I would then forward them to Camp Chase for confinement by order of General Rosecrans. It was not long before they commenced coming back, fat, saucy, with good clothes, and returned to their old occupations with renewed vigor. As a matter of course, we were all disgusted at having our hard work set at naught and have them come back in a defiant manner, as much to say, well, what are you going to do about it? In a short time, no more of these prisoners were brought in. By this time, every bushwhacker in the country was known, and when an officer returned from a scout, he would report that they had caught so-and-so, but in bringing them in, he slipped off a log while crossing a stream and broke his neck, or that he was killed by an accidental discharge of one of the men's guns.
Oh, my God.
and many like reports, but they never brought back any more prisoners.
Huh.
Welcome.
What an admission.
To the Civil War.
Yeah.
In quotes. And George was, he was really instrumental too. I know you guys, you've heard of Blazer Scouts. Mm-hmm. Well, he was really formed Blazer Scouts. That was his idea.
For our listeners that might not know, can you talk about Blazer Scouts?
Blazer Scouts was an outfit that was put together by George Crook, in particular, 62, 63, to actually counter Mosby to a large degree, which would have been 63, and also some of the other Confederate guerrillas that were operating in Virginia, mm-hmm. West Virginia mountains, the McNeil's Rangers and those sort of things. Hand-picked men from a number of regiments, armed with Spencers. They all were armed with Spencers and revolvers. They were very effective until they got caught at Cabletown in 1864 by Mosby's men and outnumbered. I think Blazer was killed, Blazer was captured, and a lot of his men were killed there. So, but they were a very effective counter guerrilla force. Mm-hmm. And some of those theories of Blazer Scouts have been brought forward today too. Small unit actions. I mean, vicious small unit actions. So he ends up at West Virginia. He goes into action against Harry Heath at Lewisburg, West Virginia. Commanding George has 2 regiments, the 36th and the 44th Ohio. The 44th is from his neighborhood, especially. It's Miami, Montgomery County. A lot of the guys knew him very well. He was wounded slightly there. He would move on in the Maryland campaign, end up at the Battle of South Mountain, which his brigade would fight there at Fox's Gap, help turn the Confederates out of that position. And then at the Battle of Burnside's Bridge. And at Burnside's Bridge, he it's sort of an interesting deal. He's put in position. He was part of the Kanawha Division, and he was put in position on the east side of Burnside's Bridge behind the Rise, back on a farm, the Rohrbach farm, I believe. Anyhow, really didn't know where he was. So at 10 a.m. in the morning that morning, a captain rides up, a staff officer, and says, General Cox, who was in charge of the division at the time, said, wishes you to take the bridge. And George was a brigade commander. He had the 36th at the time, and the 30th Ohio, and the 28th Ohio. And he says, I wish you to take the bridge. And George says, well, where is the bridge? And the staff officer says, I don't know. And then George asked him where the stream was. And the staff officer said, I don't know. So George said he made some remarks to the staff officers that weren't very kind on such a way of doing business, but he just rode off. So he put his brigade, led off by the 11th Ohio, which was another unit that was from the neighborhood. That was a Miami County unit. They all knew George, and they all knew the Crooks, to reconnoiter the bluffs, and they came up into position. They were actually the first unit to try to charge across Rohrbach or Burnside's Bridge. Their colonel, Coleman, who was a friend of the Crook family, was from near Troy, Ohio. In fact, Coleman had been in West Point at the same time George was. He just didn't graduate. He just went home. There's a little story there, but he tried. They held him back like a year or two, and they said, you probably should go home. But he ended up being a great regimental commander. So, they make the charge, and Coleman gets killed, and George pulls his guys back, finally gets one of his regiments to cross the bridge on the north side of the bridge, about the same time the Twin 51st are making their charge across the bridge. He was not a happy man about the lack of reconnoitering by the staff officers and knowing where he should go and it should be put in. He says the 2 Pennsylvania regiments crossed without a loss and got credit for taking the bridge. I understood that both their colonels were made brigadier generals for this service. And he talks about Coleman being killed too. And he was really salty about the fact that he didn't get the credit. And this is something through George's career. He could get sideways a little bit about getting credit when he thought credit was due. So after his action in Burnside's Bridge in that campaign, they end up, the division ends up getting a horrible march from Sharpsburg to, they went to Hancock, where they got on a train, and they ended up in Tennessee. Carthage, Tennessee was their next duty station. And so now these guys have gone from West Virginia to Virginia, and now they're going into action in Tennessee. He would fight at Tennessee. He would be promoted to the command of the 2nd Cavalry Division in Tennessee, and then he would end up at Chickamauga, where he would fight his division on the right flank. And then he had a particularly great campaign against Joe Wheeler in Tennessee. Joe Wheeler tried to go on a raid after the Battle of Chattanooga, and Sherman or Grant sent Crook after him. Grant was a real fan of George Crook. He really was, because they were pretty much alike in personality, you know. So George ends up chasing Joe Wheeler, chases him down, Battle of Farmington, a lot of casualties on the Confederate side. Wheeler pretty much took it on the nose there. So we get into 1864. Now, a couple of things. I'll back up real quick. After that campaign in Tennessee, George gets called back to West Virginia. And now he has commanded a brigade of infantry. He's commanded a division. He's commanded a division of cavalry. He's been in Tennessee. Now he gets called back to West Virginia. And he ends up being part of the campaigns in West Virginia and Virginia, part of the Sigel, Hunter, Lynchburg campaign. He also attacked Dublin, burned the New River Bridge. He had Averill under his command. He ended up destroying the railroad. They're very successful. His guys then would support Hunter in Lynchburg, and then when Jubal Early got there, they retreated. They had this horrible retreat back into West Virginia, back to Charleston, okay, with his division. And that's why they called them the Mountain Creepers or Crook's Buzzards, because these guys, you know, which was basically then the Army of Western Virginia or the 8th Corps, whichever you want to term it, you know. Even though the 8th Corps overlaps into the middle division sometimes. But so then he ends up getting called with his troops, some of his troops, to Monocacy to join with Wright to go chase Early back into the Shenandoah Valley. And that's where they get involved with the Battle of Cool Spring, which George's troops, he pushes them across the river. We've talked about that before. Pushes them across the river. Horatio Wright refuses to send Ricketts across. I believe it was Ricketts to his support. George was really, really upset and salty about that lack of support. He said, I saw a lot of good men killed there. I lost a lot of good men killed there basically because of the incompetence. So after that happened, George's star is really on the rise. Okay, he has been a really solid commander of all branches except for the artillery. So he gets through the Cool Spring campaign battle, and then he ends up in Winchester, and south of Winchester around Kernstown. And what happens?
Second Battle of Kernstown.
Second Battle of Kernstown. Now, what happened? George just was asleep at the switch.
Yeah.
I mean, he refused to believe his subordinates that there was Confederate forces nearby. He thought it was just cavalry. He basically berated them, and he got basically kicked all the way back across the Potomac with his divisions. So really a black eye. And once that happened, that's when Lincoln and Grant decided that we need to have a stronger command presence in the Shenandoah Valley, and along comes Sheridan. Now, Sheridan and Crook, they're good old buddies.
Yeah.
And they were still good old buddies. So we start that campaign. We start that 1864 Shenandoah campaign, and Crook has command of his Army of West Virginia, kind of a separate entity. So when they get to the Battle of Third Winchester, Crook his guys are more or less held in reserve at the beginning. And according to his autobiography, it's his suggestion that they flank the Confederates on the Confederate left. It's his suggestion that they take, that they go in, and the cavalry charge ended up overriding what he felt his infantry had done in that battle.
He discusses that in the post-war years?
Oh, yeah, he does. Sheridan had promised him that he said that his guys captured 1,000 men, and that Averill took credit for it. And Sheridan said, don't worry about it. In my report, I'll make it all right. Well, Sheridan didn't write that report until 1866.
Yeah.
And he just he doesn't even mention Crook by name.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Well, they had a bit of a falling out too at that battle, did they not?
well,
Not yet.
It doesn't get.
It's like looming.
You know, in my mind, you know that John Buford would call Devon his heavy hitter. You know, at the beginning of the Shenandoah campaign, I think Crook was really Sheridan's
100%.
heavy hitter.
Yeah.
You know, he was his old friend. He trusted him. You know, so we've got 3rd Winchester success. A couple of days later, we're at Fisher's Hill. And Fisher's Hill, if I would only had a tour, I could understand this.
I know. I'm so sorry, Phil.
The
Thunderstorms.
thunderstorms, the rain. No, so, and Fisher's Hill is, the Gibraltar of the Valley. Early is well entrenched there, even though he doesn't have many men. They've been really decimated. There is a discussion of whether we should go around the Confederate right. Crook says, he goes to his meeting, the Council of War, and he takes Hayes with him.
Rutherford B.
Rutherford Hayes, soon to be, 1876, be president, who was just, they had a really great friendship.
Yeah.
Hayes named one of his sons Webb Crook Hayes, and I think he won the Medal of Honor in the Philippines, or was awarded the Medal of Honor in the Philippines. So anyhow, but Crook just didn't talk real well. He wasn't, a real talker. So he took Hayes with him to make the argument, and I think he had Duvall with him too, his other, Art Thoburn.
I think Thoburn was there.
Okay, so they make the argument to make this march around the Confederate left.
Because he scouted it. He's seen it.
He did, he scouted himself. So they had this, march complete around the left at night through the woods. He said they're the best division to do it because these were all mountain guys. They'd been in the mountains for the whole war, so they really knew how to work the terrain. They get on the Confederate left, smashing attack. Crook is, leading the attack. He said he scooped up a bunch of rocks because he had some stragglers, and he was throwing out his guys behind, throwing rocks to get them to move up the hill, So success, a tremendous success. Even though Sheridan would be mad at Averill and actually release him because he said he didn't follow him up with his cavalry. Yeah. But there's an argument made in Eric's little Phil book that he really didn't understand what he was supposed to do. So I guess Sheridan really lost his temper. I guess it was a real nasty berating. I can see this little guy jumping up and down. But so then George, that's George's Fisher Hill. So then we end up at Cedar Creek. And, things are really calmed down. George's division, actually it's 2 divisions, but now are less than 3,000 guys total, are basically kind of on the left flank. And George will write that Sheridan took away their cavalry screen and then didn't assign anybody else. He had sent out an officer of the day to kind of reconnoiter. That guy was captured, and the Confederates made their smashing attack at Cedar Creek and rolled back, Sheridan's army north of Middletown. And after Sheridan made his ride, it is said that he told Crook at a campfire that night, and I'm paraphrasing, that it wouldn't have made any difference that I came up here. This would have ended up the way it did because of his subordinates, including Crook, solidifying the line. And then, now whether that is true or not, I don't know. George would end up, after that fight, he would get assigned back to the West Virginia.
Back to West Virginia. And this is when one of the most interesting things of his story happened during the Civil War. And we've glossed over a lot of little things, but he was in Cumberland, Maryland, in a hotel in February. Okay,
this one,
1865. Things are winding down. He and Benjamin Kelly, another Federal general, are in the hotel, and then McNeil's Rangers launched this tremendous raid. Cold night, 0 night, up through. They come north from Romney, and they steal into town. They get the password from what Crook calls the dumb Dutchman guards, and they hit the hotel and end up capturing both Kelly and Crook. And so, Crook basically said, well, I'm catcher, and I might as well go with them. So they put him on a horse and put Kelly on a horse, and Kelly was pretty upset. But the Confederate captors said Crook would basically just he's kind of stoic about it.
Went with it.
Went with it. So, he got captured and, kind of embarrassing, and he ended up getting exchanged almost immediately.
Yeah.
Now, you would think that a guy who gets captured in his night clothes in a Cumberland hotel might be done for the end of the war. Now, Grant put him in command of what was the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac, which was really just one division then, because Sheridan had command of the rest of the cavalry corps for the Appomattox campaign. And George fought them through the Appomattox campaign, and he was in at the end at Appomattox. So here we go. We can recap his Civil War service. Now, let me back up a little bit. The guy who led the Ranger attack was soon to be his brother-in-law.
Huh.
Because Mary Daly, who he would marry in August of 1865, was a native of Cumberland, and her brother rode with McNeil's Rangers.
Just a minor detail.
Yeah. So, I wonder how Christmas was there for them. So anyhow, so he ends up, the war ends, and to take a quick view back to his war service, just starting in West Virginia against the guerrillas, okay, his experience later on at Lewisburg, where he won a battle. He would fight a small unit battle against action, which he seemed to thrive in. The Appomattox campaign, getting sent to Tennessee, the Tullahoma campaign, Chickamauga campaign against Joe Wheeler, back to West Virginia, Cloyd's Mountain. He fought there. And then back into the Shenandoah Valley, Cool Spring. I mean, his combat experience was tremendous, and he always seemed to be needed. It seemed that commanders would move him around, would request George Crook's presence. Okay, so we get to the end of the war, and what happens to George is what happens to a lot of officers. He reverts back to a captain right away. That's something that's always been fascinating to me, is overnight these guys end up, after commanding, armies and corps and divisions, ends up being a captain. And he gets sent right back. They send him back to the West Coast, back to the Oregon, Washington area. But during the war, he did receive he received the following brevets, which I think we should mention. Major in the U.S. Army for services at Lewisburg, brevet lieutenant colonel, U.S. Army for gallant meritorious services at Antietam, brevet colonel, U.S. Army for gallant meritorious service at Farmington, Tennessee, brevet brigadier general, U.S. Army for gallant meritorious services in the campaign of 1864 in West Virginia, and then brevet major general, U.S. Army for gallant meritorious services in the Battle of Fisher's Hill, Virginia. So he ran the table when it came to getting his brevet ranks. But now he's back. He is back to
captain.
Back to captain. He's back on the West Coast, and that way first he marries Mary, August 22nd in Cumberland, and he wrote a letter. He was so excited about marrying this woman. He wrote a letter to Rutherford Hayes. He said, "I was duly married on the 22nd, and am feeling as happy as one who has so suddenly changed his past." So out west he goes. Of course, Mary stays east, and he ends up fighting another 2 or 3 years out on the coast to when he is requested to go to Arizona to fight the Apaches, Geronimo and Cochise. And he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go to Arizona. But they told him that it would be a temporary assignment. It's kind of interesting. The man he took over command for was George Stoneman, who you would recognize him as another commander of cavalry for the Army of the Potomac. And so Mrs. Stoneman, they had a social function, and Mrs. Stoneman didn't like it one bit that her husband was getting relieved, and George would write that it was a very uncomfortable evening with Mrs. Stoneman. She basically iced him. So he goes down to the Apaches, and the Apaches had just been a terror under Geronimo. Civilians, both sides of the border. And again, he adapted his small unit. He adapted his small unit actions. He got native scouts, Apache scouts, to work against the renegade Apaches. Small units, small 10, 15-minute guys, a couple of mules out on campaign and stay after them until you bring them in. When he would bring them in, though, what he would do with the Native Americans is he would say, we are going to put you in a situation as farmers where you can have your own home and your own crops and make your own money at this and become profitable. Okay, and I'm not going to. He wouldn't lie to them, and it worked. It really worked with the most of the Apaches. It was not a strict reservation system. They had good land, and they were able to make money. And then George left. And then the Bureau of Indian Affairs would take it over again, and the corrupt Bureau agents would end up, getting the Indians, not paying them what they were worth for their crops. And he would end up having to come back after he got called to go to the Department of the Platte. And that was in 1876. And this is where we get to the Battle of the Rosebud. And George, all his Indian campaigns had been small unit campaigns against small groups of Indians, many that he led himself. He gets into the Department of the Platte. They start the 1876 campaign. The first part of it is the Battle of Powder River in March of 1865, where he is in command of a force, but not tactical command. That was left to a guy by the name of Joseph Reynolds, who had been a Civil War general too. And they attacked, surprised a village on the Powder River in the winter, obviously, March. Drove the Indians out of the village, captured the pony herd, did everything they were supposed to do, and then Reynolds kind of double-clutched. The Indians took the high bluffs on each side of the camp. The camp was down in a lowland to protect it during the winter from wind and such, and started sniping at the soldiers. The soldiers ended up having to retreat, and they left their dead and a couple wounded behind. And Crook would end up court-martialing Reynolds. Reynolds would be suspended for a year from the service. June comes, 1876. And now we're going to start the Little Bighorn expedition. We've got 3 different groups, Army groups. You got John Gibbon's group, on the Yellowstone, western part of what today would be Montana. You've got Terry coming down from the east, okay, and he's got Custer with him, or will have Custer with him, okay, and then you've got George Crook coming up from the south with his force of about 1,000 infantry and cavalry. And a lot of people think that, these 3 arms, these 3 groups were supposed to act in concert with each other. Well, there's no way they could. There's no way they could communicate. They were just supposed to move and somehow try to force the Indians back into the reservation, or back into a pocket where they could force them into the reservation or bring them to battle. One of the 3 groups. Gibbons had probably the weakest group, basically more infantry, even though he did have a couple of Gatling guns with him. Of course, Custer had the 7th Cavalry, and he refused the Gatling guns, which wouldn't have made any difference. And George had like 1,000 infantry, 1,000 total troops, with some cavalry too included. So George starts north and ends up on Rosebud Creek, and he goes into camp. There hadn't been much Indian activity at all. he goes into camp, and he's actually playing cards. He loved to play solitaire. He was a great solitaire player. So he's playing cards. His Indian scouts come rushing in and say, basically, there's Indians everywhere, and the numbers vary. 1,000, maybe as many 1,500 Sioux warriors under Crazy Horse come just streaming out of the landscape and on the attack. And this was all new, how aggressive they were. They came from the folds of the ground. If you ever go out to the Rosebud, and I've been there, it's amazing terrain. It's vast, but there's a lot of areas where Indians can just appear, And so George starts, put a defense together. He ends up going to a high hill called Crook Hill, and that's where he takes the infantry. And there's part of his cavalry ends up under Royal, goes clear to the left, and the battle starts, a 4 or 5 hour battle. And what Crook does, what Custer didn't do, is he manages the battle from one location. Where Custer was, he broke apart his command into different elements, and he was leading the lead element himself. But Crook stayed on Crook Hill and managed to manage the battle to the point that basically what I think happened is the Indians wore themselves out more than anything else, and would end up falling back. There is one portion of Crook's unit that would make a march trying to find the Indian village, and they were going up a ravine, and they decided that there might be an ambush, so they came up the side of the ravine, and they actually came in behind some of the Indians that were attacking. That shook up some of the Indians. They just pulled back. But I just think that they had, I always wonder when Indian attacks is how they get their ammunition. What's their logistic supply for ammunition a lot of times. So George is, he's got a bloody nose. He's never seen this many Indians. They've never been this aggressive. Okay, his men have fired. He's lost 10 killed, number wounded. They fired 25,000 rounds.
Wow.
Okay, and a lot of people, and they say they hit maybe 10, 15, 20 Indians were killed. The account they don't know, because the Indians would take their dead a lot of times and wounded off the field.
It's always amazed me, that much lead flying around and that little casual. Like, you'd think there'd be so many more killed.
Well, this is my opinion. Captain Royal and his detachment had gone clear to the left. And if you go out there, you can see how vast this is. And Crook called them back repeatedly. And Royal basically, I think it was 2nd U.S. Cav, and he had to basically fight his way back. Most of the casualties of Crook's that fight are in the 2nd U.S. And so he's got to fight himself back. Crook had the infantry basically with him up on Crook Hill. And what I think a large part of the expenditure ammunition was covering fire to get Royal back. Okay, because the infantry had the 45-70 trapdoor, which the Indians called the Long Tom. It had great range, and I really think what they were doing is just providing covering fire. They had had no artillery, so it basically small arm artillery. So George comes back, and he ends up going back to his camp. Okay, Camp Cloud Peak, Mountain Cloud Peak. And you have to think he's taken a lot of criticism, even at the time, for just sitting there. He actually sat there till 1st of August. He waited for reinforcements to come, but he didn't know what happened to Custer until July 10th. Now, he had gone...
When is this?
This is June 17th. Okay? So he hadn't heard. There was no couriers to get through. Okay, he had no idea where Terry was. He didn't know where Gibbon was, and what he did know was he had expended 25,000 rounds of ammunition. His men were low on food. He had wounded. He had killed, and he had just been really attacked by a big force of very mad Native Americans. So there's a lot of people who say, well, if Crook would have held his position, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Little Bighorn is about 30 miles north of where the Battle of Rosebud took place. He would have, held his position, or he would have pursued. The Battle of Little Bighorn would have been different. I don't think so.
And forgive my ignorance, but I'm no Casey Turbin, so I don't know the Battle of Little Bighorn as well. So are these the same natives that are fighting Crook that fight Custer?
You bet.
Okay,
And
see, I figured it. I just wanted to.
And they were sort of like the Washington Commanders after they beat the Bengals.
Yeah.
They had the bit in their mouth. I mean, they had been victorious. They felt they'd been victorious, and yeah.
But the Battle of Rosebud, I mean, that wasn't it wasn't a loss for Crook, right?
No.
I mean, he held the ground. The natives pulled away, and then he doesn't stay there because he was just attacked there. So he knows to go back to what's safe.
Crook would argue that tactically he won the battle because they left the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, and look, you compare to what happened to Custer, 30 miles away.
Yeah.
A couple of 10 days later, 8 days later. Okay, Custer gets wiped out. Now, not to a man, but and Crook ends up basically his force can fight another day. So he ends up. He ends up staying in camp until August. He waits till Merritt comes up with a relieving cavalry force, and then he decides to start moving after the Sioux. So he's moving north
Again.
and Terry finally is hooked up with him, and Terry's column is moving south. And there is a wonderful quote, and you get to, if I can find it here, about how Crook looked like when he met Terry. They were in camp, and Terry had put on his dress uniform, and he is moving into Crook's camp. The two columns had finally found each other, kind of wanted each other. His men were having to eat their horses to stay alive. I mean, that's how brutal that march north was in pursuit of the Sioux. They said there we met, they talked about going to camp. We met General Terry, and Terry himself in a fancy uniform. The picture of the gentleman and soldier came over to our bivouac to call on Crook. And Crook was drying his Crook's captain was drying his buckskin by the fire. And he said, where can I find General Crook, to his captain? And he said, for a moment I could not answer. Then an old trooper grinned and nodded toward the river. And there, squatted on a rock well out in the stream, stripped to the waist and scrubbing away at his shirt, was our general. And Terry was too much of a gentleman even to look amused at the sight. So there's Crook, who is scrubbing himself, watching himself in the screen while Terry's got his dress uniform on to look at him. Crook's appearance on campaign was really something too. He didn't like a uniform, so he wouldn't wear a uniform. He rode a mule, and the mule, he carried a shotgun usually across the pommel. He said young officers from West Point would look at him in wonderment. Instead of a somewhat unapproachable dignitary in precise uniform and epaulets and sash and belt, they were welcomed by a cordial hand grasp from a tall, bushy, bearded man with twinkling gray-blue eyes in an old slouch felt hat, flannel shirt, rough canvas shooting coat, and trousers, and common soldier's blouse. He said generally the beard was tied up in a string of red tape, the only use he had for that usual military indispensable item. He sat at campfire or in the simply furnished parlor of an army home, listening to the chat, taking in everything around him and playing solitaire.
Loves the solitaire.
He would just play solitaire. That's what he would do.
What's the dynamic like with these veteran, Civil War veteran commanders and leadership in the United States military with fresh, just out of the academy, rank and file that had not been engaged with the Civil War? Is there, with your background and knowledge with the Indian Wars, post-Civil War, is there any dynamic shift, and does it affect much?
Well, I think, the post-Civil War West Pointers had a certain view of some of the famous generals. One of the best accounts of service with Crook is written by a guy by the name of Charles King. And King would become... he wrote a ton of books after the Civil War. A lot of boys' books, a lot of boys' military books. But first, to back up on King a little bit, King was the son of Rufus King, who was the first commander of the Iron Brigade. And he was actually an aide to his father early on in the war, and then he got in West Point, graduated in '66. His first duty station was Newport Barracks, Kentucky, across the river from Cincinnati, where it is reported he actually played baseball for the Cincinnati Redlegs for a year or two while he was in service there. He gets sent out to Arizona under Crook as an aide to Crook, and he would actually end up getting wounded badly in action, and the sergeant who would rescue him from the Apaches would be awarded the Medal of Honor for rescuing him. He was hurt so badly that he ended up retiring and moved to Wisconsin, where he wrote books and was a brigadier general. But if you look at him, he idolized Crook. Crook's main aide, a guy by the name of John Bork, wrote Campaigning with Crook, and he idolized Crook. A lot of Crook's, so the new soldiers, and even the old soldiers, really liked him because he would go with them wherever they went. He was not a stay behind. He ate the same rations. He was a good hunter. He would provide for them by hunting. He loved to hunt, and he loved taxidermy. And, so he was in his element whenever he could hunt. But sometimes it proved to be a benefit to his men. Now, some of his Civil War contemporaries, as they fought for rank in the regular army, really didn't like Crook. And Crook ended up becoming a brigadier general in the regular army fairly quickly. You could almost do a whole podcast on that dynamic of how he got that command versus some other people. And then he ended up, major general, the ranking major general after Terry retired in 1884, 85. But for the guys coming out of the West Point, they loved serving with him.
That's cool.
Really did. They really did. He was a really, and I would too, because he was just a really dependable, solid, down-to-earth officer.
Yeah.
Who didn't like the pomp and circumstance of the military at all. As you get into, like I said, we're glossing over a lot of things, but I think one of the most important things that I'll hit real quick, and we can kind of wrap this up a little bit, is that in the 1880s or 1870s, there was a Indian tribe, the Poncas, in Nebraska, and they had a chief by the name of Standing Bear. And long story short, they were a peaceful tribe. They had been guaranteed land, under treaty. They liked it. It was basically their native land. And then another treaty was written, and the Sioux were given their land, and they moved the Poncas like 600 miles south to Oklahoma to bad dirt. And the chief Standing Bear actually his son died, and he wanted to bring his son back to be buried on the native land. So they left the reservation. Well, then Crook was ordered. At that time, he was in charge of the Department of Nebraska. He was ordered to pursue and arrest Standing Bear. And his followers was like a dozen of these Indians trying to walk 400 miles back to their homeland to bury his son. Crook at the time allowed himself through the efforts of an editor of a newspaper and some pro-Indian factions in Nebraska, actually allowed himself to be sued by the Indians, Standing Bear, for removal, for the fact they had no rights. And the decision would come down that the American Indian had the rights. Native American had the same rights as anyone else in the country when it came to being moved without cause. And it is really an interesting legal brief to win. And Crook allowed himself. They said when the verdict was handed down, here he is, an officer of the U.S. Army, he's being sued. They win. U.S. court, he wins. They said he just smiled. But that was his. The Standing Bear incident is something I didn't know about till I really got into Crook. And today, in the U.S. Capitol, there's even a recent statue of Standing Bear there. So, that may have been Crook's shining moment. I want to see if I can find my Standing Bear quote here for you guys.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to learn about how much he did post-Civil War. I mean, you just when you study the war, or you study a campaign during the war, you just know Crook and the role he plays in those battles, and then maybe the relationship that post-war with Sheridan that often, in those memoirs and things like that. And that's all it really is, that's all people know about Crook. So to be able to dive a little bit deeper into the role he plays post-war, even pre-war, how that pre-war stuff develops him to be the general we know.
It is, again, his actual combat experience is just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. And, you talk about his relationship with Sheridan, which would really come to a head after Crook read his report on the Valley campaigns and felt that he didn't get any credit that he deserved. And then, Crook was sent back to Arizona. Again, another Apache uprising. Who you going to call? You're going to call George. He goes back, and he ran afoul of Sheridan did not think that his use of Indian scouts, which had proved to be so successful in so many fields, was the answer. He didn't think the Indian scouts would fight their other Indians, and they would. But George did not want to campaign without the use of his Indian scouts. And his first initial campaign when he got back is he actually went to Mexico. Very successful expedition in Mexico. But basically, he just disappeared off the map. Nobody could find him in his command. And he fought the Apaches in the mountains of Mexico and brought them back. Killed the ones that were the renegades. And one account is that he told one of the Apache chiefs, I will not attack your village or kill your people if you bring me the 7 heads of the Apaches who had committed the crimes against the civilians, and they did. They brought him 7 heads, so Wow. So he gets Sheridan decides that Crook can't live on this, so he just says, "I'm going to resign," and Sheridan accepts his resignation right away.
Wow. And
they put Nelson Miles into command, and his campaign drags on. Eventually, they'll end up getting Geronimo again, and they'll send him, to Florida, and the Indians hated to see George go, but George had this. By now, he had really developed a really dislike for Sheridan. It's kind of interesting. If you read what George wrote when Sheridan died, and then the next year, which is in 1889, Crook would visit, the only time he ever visited the battlefields of, it's like 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill. And he would say that, he took an aid. He said, we then took horses a little after sunup and went to the Cedar Creek battlefield, and some 2.5 miles getting back for dinner. After dinner, we were with the same horses rode over to Fisher's Hill battleground, a couple of miles up the valley. After examining the grounds and the position of the soldiers after 25 years, which had elapsed, and in the light of subsequent events, it renders General Sheridan's claims and the subsequent actions in allowing the general public to remain under the impressions regarding his part in these battles when he knew they were fiction, all the more contemptible. The adulations heaped upon him by a grateful nation for his supposed genius turned his head, which added to his natural disposition, caused him to bloat his little carcass with debauchery and disputation, which carried him off prematurely. George Crook on his college roommate,
Wow.
On his West Point roommate, yeah. So the quote the year before when he died, when Sheridan died, Crook was very nice and, told him what a nice, famous American he was. But I think George really knew that his friend had really kind of betrayed him. Crook would be in command of the Department of Missouri. He would die March 31st, 1890. He had not been feeling well. He was only 62. The rigors of all these campaigns had taken its toll on him. He had gotten up in the morning. He had a routine of working out with dumbbells. He was working out, lifting.
Good for him.
He did. Had a heart attack and died in a hotel.
He was only 62.
Only 62. Only 62.
How old was Sheridan? It's just Sheridan was the same age, was it? Right?
Yeah, he died a year before.
So 61, 60?
Yeah, but he was carried off by that debauchery and his.
He was fat, right? He got real fat.
Yeah, bloated his little carcass. That's what George was talking about.
That's a rough one there.
Yeah, it is a rough one. But so big. I mean, this is big news. If you look at the newspapers for that, big funeral. Initially, the Dayton papers were all excited because they said he was going to be buried in the Little Bethel Cemetery, which is about 5 miles from my house. Well, that didn't happen. Nope. Mary, his wife, by that time, he had built a house they never lived in Oakland, Maryland, called Crook's Nest. And Mary had him interned there, and he was only there a year before they moved him to Arlington, where he is now. But his death was big news in the country. Interesting enough, his brother Walter would die 8 years later to the day that George died, March 31st.
And he was 8 years
He was
older.
Yeah, he was 8. Yeah, he was a lot older
Wow.
too. Yeah, but I mean, George basically wore him out. To kind of close, George dies in March, and Wounded Knee is December, same year. Okay, the massacre at Wounded Knee, or the Battle of Wounded Knee. I think anybody who reads about Wounded Knee understands that it's a terrible chapter in American history. And his aide, John Bork, would basically say about that. He said, by December 1890, Indian troubles reached their final bloody anticlimax at Wounded Knee. And have you guys studied much on Wounded Knee?
No.
That is the 7th Cavalry. The Sioux had a medicine man who had said that the ghost dance, the ghost of all the warriors are going to come back. And they were going to rise up and take back their lands. And basically, they're on the reservation. It was in the winter. And the 7th Cavalry was brought into action. And the 7th Cavalry had not forgotten, Little Bighorn. So it was quite the massacre and of Indian women and children. I don't have the numbers of how many died, but it was in the hundreds. And so Bork would say, by December 1890, Indian troubles reached their final bloody anticlimax at Wounded Knee, an affair which, in light of his record, the general would have been able to prevent. Captain Bork, who was waiting the publication of his book about the general, commented briefly, "Now that he is dead and we have taken to slaughtering women and sucklings with Hotchkiss guns, the nation feels it has lost one of its greatest sons." And there is no doubt that I think George could have mediated that, because that's when he was at the best. It's going to the Native Americans and saying, I'm going to tell you the truth. This is how it's got to be, but I will stand by you and I will help you make this transition. And, it's a fight that's still going on today for the Native Americans and their rights.
Yeah.
But he was from a guy who in the 1850s is fighting Indians and calling them bucks, okay, and shooting down bucks, to a guy who gets to the point late in his life where he is allowing himself to be an advocate for Indian rights. It's just an amazing journey to me.
Yeah, it's all about life and
it
growth.
really is, and flexibility.
Yeah.
So that is a pretty brief overview of George Crook. Like I said, we could do a podcast on any one of the
Part
features
2.
of his. Oh, yeah, we could. And I would hope that someday we can arrange to get my good friend Jim Hessler in here to talk about the Custer campaign, and maybe I'll come in and sit with him and make sure he has water and everything.
There you go.
Make sure he's taken care of. So
Exactly.
yeah, I hope we can do that too.
Yeah. But anything else you want to add, like a big takeaway that you've learned in the research that you didn't know before that changed your look on Crook?
You know what? There's one thing. I'm looking at some highlights here, and as you get going, you miss things. But here is a list, okay, of the Indian tribes that he fought against in his career. The Rogue River, the Klamath, the Shasta, the Modoc, the Pitt River, the Paiute, the Bannock, Nez Perce, Apache, Navajo, Sioux, Shoshone, Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Pawnee, all of them.
Wow.
So, yeah.
In the Confederate States of America.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I encourage anybody who has an interest in George Crook, to read his autobiography. It's out there. You can get it. I mean, it's general trade. And again, Paul McGidd's 3 volumes on him is really, really excellent in his research. But there's a lot more to unpack with George than what we did here. We just kind of did a quick overview. And maybe someday we'll just do a Civil War George.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much, like all those battles you named. I mean, you could go into each of those and his leadership there and the role he played.
That whole West Virginia 1861, early 62 deal with him, and just setting it right by making sure that the bushwhackers were taken care of. Yeah. I mean, people, that's not exactly the glorious Don Troni painting of the American Civil War, is it? But that's the reality.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. That's the reality.
Yeah.
So, give George Crook a look. One of the things that I'm going to start working on, and it's something that I've been remiss, and I started a number of years ago and didn't follow through, is to get a historical marker put up near his birthplace. There's
nothing that identifies.
There's nothing. It's back in the woods of what ruins of the foundation are there. But there's nothing. People in the township just they don't know.
Huh. Well,
maybe
next time we have you on, we'll have an update on that.
Well, yeah.
New project.
Yeah, new project. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Phil, so much for coming on. Thanks for bringing on the Horse Soldier and the meeting with that. Well, it was pretty good.
Keep our friend Eric Wittenberg in your prayers. That he needs those more than anything right now. I just want to see him get back on his horse and get back on the circuit again. He is a heck of a historian and a heck of a good friend. And these sorts of challenges can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
2 years ago, we were on the field at Culpeper and Brandy Station.
Yeah.
Okay. And he's leading the tour, doing what he does best. And, and all of a sudden, bam. So, yeah. Pray for the guy.
Yeah, we're all one community here.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, well, Phil, thank you again for coming on. And,
thanks, guys.
Thank you.
We'll catch you on the next one.
Yep.